Hey guys, how's it going? So in today's video, I'm going to be showing you how to build a API that you can leverage. But more importantly, if you want to do things like web scraping, for example, and you're afraid that maybe your IP may get banned, I'm actually going to show you how to use a SOX proxy. More importantly, you're going to be navigating through the Tor network to be pulling these API requests or these web scraping requests. So in today's video, we're going to do a couple of things. First, I'm going to show you how to actually run the proxy itself. Second, every single time that we run the proxy, we're going to go ahead and change the IP address so that we don't get banned by one specific IP. And then last, we're also going to put in a little check in here to make sure that we're actually protected and we're not going to be using our real IP, or real public IP, that we are in fact going to be using a proxy. So I'm going to show you how to do that. What we're going to be pulling is, when I go ahead and run this, you'll see what we're going to pull is we're going to pull the weather forecast, except there's one thing missing here, and that is I need to go ahead and start the Tor network. So to do that, I'm just going to type in Tor, and we're going to walk through all this in very quick detail here. But as soon as I run the Tor proxy, and I run this again, because it's running through Tor, it's a little bit delayed, but basically I'm fetching all of this data off of an open API through the Tor network. So I'm actually going through the Tor proxy, going through the Onion router or the Tor network, which basically goes to 3 different layers, so that it's very, very difficult to trace back the original IP. Now, it's not bulletproof, but it's still pretty good. So I'm going to show you exactly what this code does and how to build it. So let's get started. All right, so let's talk through how this works. So you have a client machine, which is your device in this case. And let's say your device has an IP 1.2.3.4. What's going to happen is that IP address is going to be sent across the actual headers. And in addition to that, you're also going to be sending some parameters. So you're going to send, for example, I want the city to be equal to Toronto. I want the number of days to be equal to 5. And then you're going to be sending your key across as well. And you're also sending other things in your header as well. So you're sending the IP, for example. You're going to be sending things like the user agent, and then also maybe some more device-specific stuff. So some more device information, whatever that may be. I apologize for the bad writing. I'm trying my best on my iPad here to do this. But anyways, regardless, that information then gets relayed over to the server. And so the server is going to go and it's going to say, okay, I'm going to look into my database repository here. And I'm going to go ahead and, based on what you're looking for, I'm going to go ahead and pull all that information based on these request headers and the parameters. I'm going to take that information, curate it. I'm going to send it back as a response object, and in the response object, I'm basically going to have all my information, so that's going to be equal to my forecast for my weather forecast and a whole bunch of other stuff, and that gets displayed back to the client machine. Now, the inherent problem behind this is when you're doing something like web scraping, for example, because your IP address is actually getting ported over and sent to the request headers, the server, for example, now has access to that IP address. With that IP address, now they know that it's 1.2.3.4, they can go back and triangulate your location as well. But more importantly, they also take your IP address and they'll go ahead and store it in their database. And what they're going to look for is they're going to say, if this person is excessively accessing the server for whatever reason, whether I'm web scraping or doing whatever, I'm going to go ahead and I'm simply going to block this IP address. And I'm going to block this IP address. I know who they are. I know where the request is coming from, and I'm just going to stop them from getting it. Now, if you're doing web scraping and you're doing an excessive amount of it, you probably shouldn't be unless you've actually entered some kind of an agreement with them. But let's just say you're not, and you're web scraping, I don't know, whatever it may be, job descriptions, you may be web scraping other weather information that's not accessible through an API, so you're using web scraping to do it. You may be blocking yourself and your IP, but at the same time, you're also giving up certain data about yourself, especially your location and whereabouts. So to counter that, what you do is you actually go ahead and you set up a proxy. So again, client machine is going to say, I want to go 1, 2, 3, 4. I'm going to send that in my request header. And then I'm also going to have some parameters. Again, day is equal to 5. City is equal to Toronto. What happens in this case, though, is this information then goes through this proxy. So what the proxy is going to do is, if I've defined things like a fake user agent, which we did in our code and which we'll walk through in a very quick second, and if I've also put in things like device-specific info, like I'm using a Mac or an Apple or whatever that is, all that's going to get controlled by the proxy. And what the proxy is going to do, then the proxy is going to go ahead and say, okay, I'm going to send this information out, but I'm going to use my own IP address to send it. So I'm going to send it through 5, 6, 7, 8. And this proxy is associated with some kind of a Tor address. And I can't go back and triangulate or figure out the location of the actual client machine because I've covered it up through a proxy. Now what happens is the same information happens here. They're going to go through their database. They're going to go ahead and log certain information. So they'll log this IP address. They'll log your request headers. Then they'll go back, send a response. The response object goes back to the client. Great. So what's the problem with this one? Although it gives you a little bit more anonymity, the challenge here is that you don't have a floating IP address. And what that means is every time I'm accessing the Tor proxy, I'm always going to get this IP address as a result. So what can the server do? The server can go ahead and block this IP address. So while there's important information about you that is preserved, and that is your location, your IP, your actual real IP address, which is here, as long as that is not disclosed, you're okay. But if you want to do continuous web scraping against it, well, now this proxy has been blocked. So there's another way to counteract that. And the way to do that is we're going to use something called a proxy control signal. And what that does is this as follows. So it's the exact same thing. We're going to say location is equal to Toronto, days is equal to 5. This is going to say IP 1, 2, 3, 4. That's going to go ahead and get sent to the proxy signal. It's going to kick out 5, 6, 7, 8. Okay. And it's going to have the exact same parameters. So it's going to use those parameters, send those through the user agent, all that other kind of good stuff is going to get sent to the server. So we have the user agent here. Okay. What's going to happen here is it's going to go back, send the information, curate the information here, send it back through a response and go back. Okay. But now going back like the previous slide, somebody can say, well, you're going to ban 5, 6, 7, 8. Here's the beauty. Every single time you run this command and you say, hey, listen, I want to actually go ahead and get something. This IP address is a floating IP address, which means that it's going to change every single time. So what's going to happen is instead of it going into 5, 6, 7, 8, the next time it's going to go into 9, 10, 11, 12. And then the next time you run it, it's going to go into, and these numbers I'm completely making up, 100.1.1.2 or whatever it is. This number is going to change. So the server is never going to get to know a consistent pattern of all the different IP addresses that are going through. And so what you're doing is you're protecting your original IP address here. You're getting the information you want. You're changing around and sort of disguising your user agent and stuff like that. It's going to go ahead and take all this information and it's going to, disguise it. Then it's going to send it to the server and this IP address changes. And because even if they log this IP address, it doesn't make a difference because the next time they run it, it's going to change. So this is in concept how the control proxy signal works. We're going to build this out in Python and I'm going to show you how to do it. So let's get started. Okay, so obviously the first thing you're going to need to do is you're going to need to go ahead and install Tor. And the best way to do that is just type in brew install Tor in your command line. So go ahead and open up a terminal window, for example. And we'll just do that right here. So we're going to bring in this terminal window and you're just going to type in brew install Tor. Now I already have it, so I'm not going to run it. The minute you do that, it's going to it takes, depending on your computer, it could take a couple of minutes for that to run. Once that's actually done, then you can go ahead and start the Tor network just by punching in Tor. And you're going to notice that it's going to go through all this bootstrapping. And then finally, it's going to say done. Once it says done, you're going to be already on the Tor network. Now to get Tor set up, especially on Mac OS, there's also some instructions for Windows, which I'll link down below. But for Mac OS, there's a few things you're going to need to do to get this running. So getting Tor running on its own, this should be enough. But if you actually want to get your IP changed every single time you run it so that you're not running into the same IP address, there's something that we're going to have to go ahead and enable. So in order for us to do that, I'm going to open up a Finder window. And we're going to type in user/local/etc/tor/torrc. And that basically opens up the Tor folder. You're not going to have this file. What you're going to have is you're going to have something called torrc.sample. And all you're going to do is you're going to copy and paste this and you're going to remove the .sample. So you're just going to have a duplicate copy of this. Once you have that, there's only a few things we need to change. So we're going to scroll down and you're going to look for a couple of lines that we're going to uncomment. And all that does is it just allows us to go ahead and use something called control port to get a new IP address every time. So this is going to be commented like this. What you're going to do is you're going to uncomment this one. This one's also going to be commented, this hash control password, and then the cookie authentication. Now this password here in itself, even though you see that it's grayed out or it's blocked out here, you can go ahead and change this. So even if it is exposed, it's not a big issue. But anyways, and then uncomment cookie authentication. And that's all we need to do with our Tor.rc file. So we're going to go ahead and close that. I'm not going to save it because I already have everything. So now in order to get this running, we're going to go back to our Tor network here. And I'm going to show you a couple of things, okay? So first, let's go ahead and bring in some dependencies. So I'm going to bring in this. We're just going to file save this, and I'll just call this, put it on my desktop or something, and I'll just call this, I don't know, Tor example.py. So we'll call it Tor ex.py or something like that, okay? And then I'll just put it on my desktop, and we're good to go. So hit save, good, done. And that's all I really needed. What I'm going to do is I'm actually going to show you how these proxies work. So we're going to go and print out some actual proxy names or some proxy IP. So you're going to see that there's my public IP. Now my public IP, obviously I'm not going to show here. What I'm going to do is I'm going to log into my VPN provider, which in this case is Nord. If you guys do want to check them out, feel free to do so. I'll leave a link down below. But we're going to go ahead and log into Nord. And what Nord is going to act as my public IP for now. And the reason why I'm doing that is just because I don't want to expose my real public IP. You should never do that. Always keep your public IP private to yourselves. But let me go ahead and get an IP address, and then I'm going to quickly connect, and then I'll show you that we're going to be connecting into here. So what you're going to see, all right, so now that I'm logged in, what you're going to see, I have an IP address here. So when I click over there, it's 104.206.206.139. Now that's going to serve as my public IP right now. So we're going to go ahead and actually run that in Python so that you can actually see that it returns that back as my public IP. So let me go ahead and get this script here, or this little bit of code here that I put together. So basically it's a request that we're going to do into this website called HTTP bin. So we're just going to go ahead and do this. We're going to say request.get, and that's the text file that we're going to be looking to get. And I'm just making sure I don't have anything else that I need, and then we're just going to print this out. Now what this should return is this should return that exact same IP address. So when I do that, it's 104.206. I think that was the same thing that we had here. So 104.206.206.139. If I go ahead and change this, so just to prove to you that this is actually pulling whatever is in Nord, which is acting as my public IP at this point. So if I go down and I don't know, let's just pick something in the States, and I run that again, I get 91.132.137.100. Let's pull that. So that's the exact same address again. So again, this is helping you understand that assuming that I didn't have a VPN on, this would actually display my real IP. So every single time you send a request over to whatever website you're going to be doing, they will log your IP. And what happens is once they log this IP, if you pull it too many times or you break their terms and conditions, they will ban the IP. So they'll just basically blacklist your IP, and you won't be able to pull anything anymore. And especially if you're on your public IP and you're not proficient in setting up VPNs and proxies, you might run yourself into a little bit of trouble of not being able to do any more data gathering. So what we're going to do now is we're going to go ahead and set up a Tor proxy. Before I even go ahead and set up the ability to change your proxy multiple times, I'm going to go ahead and just set up a Tor proxy on its own. So what we're going to do is we're going to create a new variable called session. Now requests has sessions built into it, and that allows you to open up a specific session under the actual request module. So we're going to define a variable called session. Now under session, I'm also going to define something called proxies. So for that, we're going to have session.proxies, and the two proxies that are for Tor are actually SOCKS5 127001. So this is your local host basically at port 9050, and then also if it's an HTTPS connection, exact same scenario here as well. What you're going to see now is I'm going to leave this here actually, and I'm just going to copy and paste this, and now we're actually going to say sessions. And what this is going to do is it's going to say, okay, I'm going to open up a new request session, and I'm going to use the proxy to go ahead and pull this URL here. So let's see what we get back when we run this. Now it's actually saying there's no connection. That's because, again, I need to go ahead and run the Tor network. So let's go ahead and run Tor. So you see that this is now saying done. That's what we need. Now when I run this again, it's saying origin. This is my original proxy, which is my Nord proxy, again, acting as my public IP. And this is the proxy that the Tor network has given me. And so no matter how many times I run this, I'm going to get the exact same result, because right now I haven't told it to go ahead and change. And because I haven't told it to go ahead and change, technically what they can do is, even though this is acting as my proxy right now, they can go ahead and ban this IP if they wanted to. And in which case, my session variable, or my session for this specific Tor proxy, is no longer going to work as well unless I go ahead and change it. Now, the very simple way to change it is you would just go to your terminal file. You would go ahead and terminate this. This is one way of doing it, and rerun Tor. And you'll notice that when I run this, just note this, 185.192.212, that's actually going to change into something completely different. So this now ends in 249, and before it ended in 210, I think, or something like that. And you can go ahead and always reboot or refresh your IP address that way. But there's a better way to do it, and that's especially when you want to do multiple pulls at one specific time, and you want to automate things end to end. Your data extraction needs to get automated. So in order for us to do that, then we need to go ahead and introduce something called a controller. And the controller, basically what it does, so if I go ahead and just bring this snippet of code right here. Okay, so what the controller is going to do is it's going to say, okay, every single time I run this function called new Tor ID, which is what I basically called it, I'm saying that on port 9051, I'm going to send basically another signal for me to go ahead and get a brand new IP address. So in order for us to clean this up a bit, let me just add in a few other things. In order for controller to work, we need to go ahead and add in a few other libraries as well. And they include stem, which is for the signal, and then for the controller as well. And this basically allows you to go ahead and authenticate. So if you go back to your original file, the Tor RC file, there was that long password that I was talking about. That's sort of what this is authenticating against. And you can go ahead and change that at any point in time as well, as long as the two match, both in here and as well as over there. Right now, it's just pulling it from the Tor RC, so it shouldn't be an issue. All right, so now that I've actually gone ahead and done that, I'm actually going to just go ahead and import the other libraries as well. These are very basic ones. There's nothing crazy about these ones here. So pprint is just to make sure your JSON looks clean when you print it. I'm going to need JSON to convert a string file into a JSON, and then also I'm going to need the OS to go ahead and pull an environment variable, because I didn't want to put my API key up here. I'd rather just put it into the environment variable, which you guys can look up how to do. But let's go ahead and clean this code up a little bit. So now, here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to replace this piece here that says all this over here, basically getting rid of all of this. And we're putting in this code. So let's walk through what this is. So this is the same as before. I'm getting a session method basically from my requests function here. Okay, so the next thing we're doing is we're going to go ahead and, again, set up the same proxy command that we had previously. The other thing I've introduced here is actually something called session.headers. And when I'm passing on my headers, I want to disguise my user agent. So every single time, change up the user agent, whether it's Firefox, whether it's Safari, whether it's a Mac, whether it's something else. I would rather just disguise that so that they can't figure out that it's coming from one specific device. And then for this specific API, we're also going to pass some parameters. So Q in this case, I'm just pulling in Toronto. The key is going to be the weather API. So what we're doing in this, we're pulling the weather current forecast, but also the forecast for the next X number of days. And we can define that here, whether it's 1 day, 5 days, whatever it is. And then we're going to get a whole bunch of data. So I haven't defined the URL piece yet, but why don't we do that? Now, before I go ahead, so let me put in this here, and I'm going to show you what happens with this as well. But this is basically calling this function that's saying that every single time that I'm going to be pulling this API, I want you to go ahead and give me a new ID. And what I'm going to demonstrate to you now is the fact that it is actually going to pull a new IP every single time. So let's forget about the top one, because we know that's my Nord one. But let's go ahead and pull this. And so it's giving me an ID of 146.59.155.27. You generally have to wait about 5 to 10 seconds, but then when we pull another one, let's see if it's refreshed yet or not. There it has, 185.220, so it's a completely new IP than what I originally had before. And these are all new, so if I'm going to run it again, and you notice I get another IP address. Now, if I were to go ahead and just block this function and comment it out, my IP is not going to change, no matter how many times. So let's just stick with this one, so it ends in 201. So I can run this as many times as I want. I'm not going to get a brand new IP address because I've basically told it, don't go ahead and send a signal for it to go and renew the IP address. I'm just going to keep the same one. And that is kind of the beauty of the way this function works. The other way I can do this is if I could just go ahead and so I get a new ID there, but I can block it at the proxy level. So I can say I'm just going to turn off the proxy up here, and this again is not going to change again. So it'll change the one time because I already ran it before, but now if I keep running it over and over again, it doesn't matter how many times I run it, I'm going to keep getting the exact same IP address. And then when I unblock this, it runs into a brand new IP address again. So that's kind of the beauty behind how this works with the Tor network. So I'm just refreshing away, and you see that I'm getting a new IP address every now and then. And that is what you want to see. So when I go ahead and pull this API, which is going to give me a whole bunch of data, and so let's just go ahead and run this. So let's see what this API is going to give me. So let's call in the URL. So the URL for this API, let's get rid of this for a sec. So the URL for this is basically http api.weatherapi.com. And then I'm going to go ahead and use my session variable. So I'm going to use the proxy to go ahead and get this URL. In there, I'm passing in the fact that I'm using the Tor proxy. I'm disguising my user agent. And these are the different parameters that I'm going to be passing. And then I've gone ahead and done the JSON loads on this because this returns a text file here. And what you want to do is you want to convert it into a JSON so that I can use pprint to make it look a lot better. So when I go ahead and run this, what you'll see now is there's just a whole bunch of data here. So it gives me the current condition. It'll also give me the forecast by hour. So there's the forecast there. It'll give me for today's date. It'll give you for different times of the day, I believe, as well, which is why there's so many different lines here. But you can see how it's very well structured. And I'm going to actually turn off pprint in just a second to show you that if I don't use pprint, it's just almost impossible to read this stuff. But there's a whole bunch of data in here that you can sort of sift through and look at. I'm just trying to find where that hour number is because I know it's in here for sure. But if you scroll through this, you'll see that it actually does show that it's at specific times of the day. But regardless, this is how you would pull this kind of information. So if I turn off pprint and I just use regular print, this is what I'm going to get. So not very usable. This is why you have to convert it and use the JSON loads to convert it into a JSON and then go ahead and read it. And I think it outputs this as a dictionary anyway. So that's kind of how you would pull this API, and then you can use this data. You can ingest it in whatever mechanism you want. You can slice and dice it and do whatever you want. But there's one more thing I want to show you, and that is sometimes you may forget to actually run the Tor network. So sometimes you may just, not realize that you haven't ran it, or for whatever reason you may have something like this commented out, the proxy, and not realize that it's commented out because you're not going to necessarily always run it from here. You may actually be running it from the terminal, so you may not even see the code. So now we're going to put in a little bit of logic, okay? And here's the logic. So I'm going to change these lines up a little bit. And the logic is going to be like so. So let me just go ahead and grab this. Okay, so we're just going to come over here and I'm going to copy paste. You're going to see this exact same code, so this isn't going to change. You're just going to see that it's down here. So the logic that I put in is I said if I use the request.get, which is going to give me my private IP or my public IP, but the only one that I should know, and if I run that IP address and it's the exact same thing as what the session variable gets me, then that tells me my proxy is not on. And what I mean by that is that means that my two IP addresses are the exact same. My public IP address and then my proxied IP address are exactly the same. And the reason they're the same is the proxy isn't on. So when you run something like that, in this scenario, it's going to work because I know that they're not the same. So when I run this, it's going to take a little bit of time, but it runs it. But if I actually go ahead and turn off my proxy, so let's go up here and actually shut off my proxy so that I'm just passing through my raw IP address and run this, it's going to say unprotected. The proxy is off because it's doing this check and it's saying your proxy is actually not on. This thing is returning the exact same thing as this thing, so you're actually putting yourself at risk. But the minute I turn my proxy back on and rerun it, there you go. So that's basically how you run it. And now this could be your request URL here. You could be using an API. You could be using something like web scraping, because at the same time, if you use something like Beautiful Soup, you're going to be using the request library anyways. So many different things you can use this for, but the most important thing is you protect yourself and protect your IP address. But I would say even if the website allows you to web scrape, and I generally look at the robots.txt and sort of obey the rules and follow the rules from the website anyways, I would still proxy it because I don't want my own private IP floating around out there. There's no need for it. There's not anything they're going to get out of it. So if I go ahead and just disguise this, no harm, no foul. Nothing goes wrong. I'm not doing anything wrong. Neither should you. You shouldn't be using this for the wrong intent or purposes, because like I said, this isn't 100% bulletproof. There's other ways to add on to this, which I'm not going to discuss here in this video, but maybe in another one, to further secure yourself even more. But other than that, Tor is a really good way to secure yourself. It's a really good network. The challenge and the danger with Tor is really depending on who's sitting on the sort of the end node. If it's somebody who doesn't have the best intentions, they can steal some very valuable information. And if you spend enough time and you gather the timestamps, you can sort of figure out a lot in terms of where the request came from, the middle node as well as the end node as well, or the exit node as they call it in Tor. So it's not always bulletproof, and for that reason I'd encourage you always to use it for good purposes. Don't use it for the wrong intentions. You can get yourself in trouble. But outside of that, I hope you found this educational. I always use Tor, or I use some kind of a proxy paid. Mostly I don't really use public proxies, but I have paid proxies as well that I'll use. But again, only for good purposes. But anyways, hopefully you guys enjoyed this. If you did, please consider liking and subscribing, and I will see you next time. Thanks very much.